There are photographs that document history, and then there are photographs that become history. This is one of them. Two men, one lighting a cigar, the other watching him with a fire that had nothing to do with flame. A moment of pause in a storm of revolution. A cloud of smoke between them, but no smoke could hide what was coming next. The man holding the cigar is Fidel Castro. The man lighting it is Ernesto Che Guevara. And in that fleeting moment, captured forever in black and white, two of the most polarizing figures of the 20th century share an intimacy not often seen in war. It looks casual. It looks calm. But that's the illusion. Because what this photograph really shows is the eye of a political hurricane, seconds before the winds rip through the world. How did they get here? How did a Cuban lawyer and an Argentine doctor become the architects of a revolution that would ignite global fears, spark proxy wars, and forever change the face of Latin America? To answer that, we need to go back. Not to Cuba, not to Havana, but to the slums of Rosario, Argentina, and the childhood of a sickly boy named Ernesto. Born in 1928, Che didn't start life with a rifle in his hand. He started it with asthma in his lungs. He wheezed. He coughed. He struggled to breathe. But he never struggled to think. Che devoured books, philosophy, politics, poetry. He read Marx before most kids his age were reading novels. He questioned everything, especially the suffering he saw around him. His family was leftist, rebellious, bohemian. But Che was something else. He wanted to see the world's pain, to touch it, to understand it. And so he left, not for revolution, not yet, but for a motorcycle trip. That trip would become the defining journey of his life. He rode across Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia. He met miners who were treated like animals. He saw lepers cast aside by society. He witnessed hunger, exploitation, racism, not in theory, but in flesh and blood. And something inside him shifted. He began to believe that medicine alone couldn't cure what he saw. The disease wasn't biological, it was political. And if politics was the disease, then revolution was the treatment. By the time Che Guevara arrived in Mexico City in 1955, he wasn't just a doctor anymore. He was a radical looking for a cause. That's when he met him. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. A man with eyes like steel and words like fire. A man who had survived prison after leading a failed attack on the Moncada barracks in Cuba. A man who had already made up his mind. Cuba would be free, or he would die trying. The chemistry was instant. They talked for hours. About imperialism. About the failures of Latin America. About utopias and guns and freedom. Che signed on immediately. Not just as a medic, but as a soldier. He would not just heal the wounds. He would make them, if necessary. Together, they boarded the Granma, a creaky old yacht carrying 82 revolutionaries across the Gulf of Mexico toward the shores of Cuba. They were seasick, overarmed, underprepared, and they were almost all killed in the first few days. Only 12 survived. Just 12. But those 12 became the seeds of a movement that would grow into something massive. They retreated into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, and there they began to build their army. It was there, between the trees, the mud, and the blood, that Fidel and Che became more than comrades. They became myth. Che proved himself brutal and brilliant. He was a guerrilla tactician, a cold strategist, but also a man who read Neruda by candlelight and wrote love letters in the rain. He executed defectors, and he cured peasants. He was feared. He was admired. He was a contradiction walking on 2 feet. And Fidel? Fidel was the voice, the dreamer, the chess master who saw Cuba not just as a battlefield, but as the first domino in a global awakening. For 2 years, they fought. For 2 years, they bled. And then, they won. In January 1959, Fulgencio Batista fled Cuba. The dictatorship collapsed. The rebels marched into Havana like victorious ghosts returning home. People cheered. Flags waved. Hope surged through the streets. And in the middle of it all, Fidel and Che, shoulder to shoulder. But revolutions don't end when the guns go silent. Sometimes, that's when the real war begins. Because now, they had to govern. And that was something no rifle could prepare them for. Cuba had changed overnight. But changing a country is not the same as fixing it. And soon, the euphoria of revolution gave way to something much darker. The first thing Fidel did was consolidate power. He purged Batista loyalists, restructured the economy, and began implementing sweeping reforms. Land was seized from the rich. Foreign-owned businesses were nationalized. Education was reformed. Healthcare was made universal. To some, it was justice. To others, it was theft. The United States, once a silent partner in Batista's regime, watched with increasing horror. This wasn't just a new government. This was a threat, a communist threat, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And Che? Che was no longer just Fidel's right-hand man. He was now the face of radical change. He oversaw executions at La Cabana prison. He signed death warrants. He spoke with cold clarity about violence being a necessary tool of justice. He gave speeches dripping with revolutionary zeal. If we tremble with indignation at every injustice, then we are comrades. But behind the speeches, behind the smoke and photographs, something was shifting between the two men. Because Fidel and Che, while united in war, were very different in peace. Fidel was pragmatic. He knew power had to be protected. He played politics like chess. He made deals. He adapted. Che was a purist, an idealist. He didn't want to govern a country. He wanted to ignite the world. He believed that Cuba was just the beginning, the match that would light fires across Africa, Latin America, Asia. He didn't want ministries. He wanted revolutions. He spoke of creating a new man through sacrifice and solidarity. He warned against capitalism, bureaucracy, and comfort. He was allergic to compromise. By 1960, Che was traveling the world. He met with Khrushchev in the USSR, with Nasser in Egypt, with Mao in China. He was building connections, preparing for a global uprising. But while Che dreamed abroad, Fidel was facing nightmares at home. The economy was collapsing. Sugar production had plummeted. American embargoes were strangling trade. Dissent was rising. So Fidel did what leaders under siege often do. He tightened control. Newspapers were silenced. Opponents were jailed. Fear became part of the revolution's toolkit, and the U.S. responded in kind. In 1961, they launched the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed attempt to overthrow Castro using Cuban exiles trained by the CIA. The operation was a disaster. Fidel's forces crushed it in 72 hours. But the consequences were massive. Cuba declared itself officially Marxist-Leninist. The USSR became its closest ally, and the Cold War crept even closer to boiling point. The following year, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet missiles on Cuban soil. American warships encircling the island. Kennedy and Khrushchev staring each other down, with Fidel as the unpredictable wild card in the middle. Che wanted confrontation. He believed nuclear war was a price worth paying if it meant liberation from imperialism. Fidel, however, flinched. And that, quietly, was a fracture. Because for Che, Fidel's hesitation wasn't caution. It was betrayal. But Che didn't say it out loud. Not yet. Instead, he began to withdraw. He left behind his government posts. He disappeared from public view. Rumors swirled. Had he died? Was he exiled? No. He was preparing for his next revolution. In 1965, the world heard his voice one last time. A farewell letter, addressed to Fidel, read aloud on Cuban radio. I formally renounce my positions in the Cuban government. I am not a liberator. Liberators do not exist. The people liberate themselves. It was a goodbye masked as a manifesto, a declaration that his mission wasn't finished, only redirected. Che Guevara had vanished into the shadows of Africa. First stop, Congo. He arrived with a small group of Cuban fighters, determined to aid the anti-colonial rebels fighting Mobutu's regime. Che thought he'd find warriors. He found chaos. The rebels were disorganized. Corruption was rampant. Ethnic rivalries tore the movement apart. Che's asthma flared. His plans unraveled. He called it one of the most disheartening failures of his life. And yet, he didn't stop. After months in the jungle, he resurfaced in Prague, then vanished again. His next destination? Bolivia, a forgotten corner of Latin America, a place few revolutionaries cared about. But to Che, it was a spark waiting for flame. He slipped into the country under a false name, disguised, a ghost among villagers. His plan: build a guerrilla movement from the ground up, train locals, spread rebellion through the Andes. It was bold, maybe too bold, because Bolivia was not Cuba. The peasants didn't rise up. They were afraid of their government, of the army, and of Che himself. The Bolivian Communist Party refused to cooperate. Che had no support, no food, no reinforcements. The CIA took notice. With help from U.S. operatives, the Bolivian army began tracking him. One by one, his fighters were killed. The jungle closed in. And Che started writing again. His final diary, a chronicle of frustration, disease, and dwindling hope, but also of conviction. Even as his strength faded, he believed. Victory is not a matter of chance, he wrote. It is a matter of will. Then came October 8, 1967. A tip from a local farmer. The army ambushed his camp in the Euro ravine. Che was wounded, captured. They took him to a small schoolhouse in La Higuera, interrogated him, photographed him, offered him a cigarette. He refused to beg, refused to betray his comrades, refused to die afraid. The next day, an order came from above. Execute him. The soldier chosen for the task hesitated. Che looked him in the eye and said, "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward. You're only going to kill a man." 9 bullets ended his life. But they didn't end his legend. His body was laid out like a trophy. The Bolivian army propped him up for photographs. Eyes half open, beard matted with blood, the face still unmistakably Che. They didn't realize what they were doing. They weren't killing a man. They were building a myth. The image of his corpse, arms limp, body riddled with bullets, was broadcast around the world. It drew comparisons to Christ, to martyrdom, to revolution as resurrection. But behind the photo, a cover-up. The Bolivian military secretly buried him. No gravestone, no record, no trace. They wanted to erase him from history. Instead, they made him immortal. Because the world didn't stop searching. Not for years, not for decades. And the legend only grew. Posters appeared on student walls across Europe. Muralists painted his likeness in the slums of Sao Paulo and the alleys of Cairo. Revolutionaries in Vietnam, South Africa, and Palestine cited him as inspiration. Even in death, Che Guevara became a global voice for rebellion. His words, reprinted, quoted, and weaponized. His face, mass-produced on T-shirts, flags, graffiti, stamps. Iconic, ubiquitous, eternal. But here's the contradiction. He hated celebrity. He rejected fame. He died for ideals, not merchandise. So how did Che become a brand? How did the man who renounced comfort and privilege become a symbol on wristwatches and perfume bottles? Because symbols don't ask questions. They don't challenge us. They allow us to remember selectively, to romanticize rebellion while forgetting its cost. Che's legacy is complicated, beautiful and brutal, visionary and flawed. He dreamed of a world without poverty, but endorsed violence to build it. He fought imperialism, but helped create one-party control. He wrote poetic reflections on love, justice, and sacrifice, but signed off on executions. He believed revolution was the path to dignity, but revolution is rarely clean. And yet, for millions, he still represents hope. Not because he was perfect, but because he believed so fiercely, so fully. He gave everything, his breath, his blood, his last heartbeat, to the idea that a better world was possible. And that idea refuses to die. The guns had fallen silent. The bearded rebels had become ministers, and Che Guevara was gone. But Cuba remained. And Fidel? Fidel became not just the leader of the revolution, but the revolution itself. In the years following Che's death, Fidel Castro began consolidating power. The fiery charisma remained, but something colder crept in, a system that tightened its grip on every corner of Cuban life. Education was free. Healthcare expanded. Cuba became a symbol for independence from U.S. domination. But the streets whispered a different truth. Censorship grew. Dissent was punished. Fear lived alongside the victories. And through it all, Che's face remained, hung in classrooms, printed on currency, raised in chants, and painted on murals. He became the eternal revolutionary, but also the convenient ghost. He was everywhere, but could no longer disagree. And Fidel? He invoked Che's name like scripture, as proof of sacrifice, as a warning, as a shield. But some began to ask, would Che have agreed with what Cuba became? Would he have tolerated the arrests of dissidents, the silencing of artists, the isolation? No one could answer, because Che was dead. And the dead cannot debate. But history does. In private corners, Cubans remembered the man behind the myth, the one who walked barefoot through villages, who shared meals with farmers, who read poetry by firelight in the jungle. They remembered his flaws, too, his harshness, his righteousness, his uncompromising vision. Che didn't believe in half measures. He believed in total transformation, and that made him dangerous, even to his friends, maybe especially to them. Because revolutions need order. They need survival. And sometimes, they sacrifice their purists to build their permanence. Che was a flame. Fidel became the furnace. And Cuba? Cuba became the house they built, together, then apart. By the 1980s, the world had changed. The Cold War burned hot. Capitalism and communism clashed on every continent. And Che Guevara's face, captured in that iconic photograph by Alberto Corda, was now immortal. But immortality has a price. His image, once feared by regimes, now smiled from coffee mugs and magazine covers. Revolutionary chic, they called it. His legacy reduced to aesthetics. But under the surface, a deeper tension stirred. In universities across the Americas, students invoked his name in protests. In South Africa, anti-apartheid leaders quoted him. In Palestine, murals bore his likeness alongside local martyrs. He had become a canvas onto which people projected their pain, their rebellion, their hope. But did they truly know him? Did they know of the execution orders he signed? The trials he presided over at La Cabana prison? The cold logic behind his utopia? Or did they only see the beret, the beard, the dream? The truth is this: Che Guevara was not a product. He was a paradox. He believed in love, yet demanded violence. He fought for freedom, yet believed in censorship. He longed for justice, yet carried out judgment. And yet, he mattered, not because he was right about everything, but because he acted. In a world drowning in apathy, he chose motion. In a time of silence, he chose sound. In a world of compromise, he chose a side. Even his enemies admitted it. He was willing to die for what he believed. And he did. That kind of conviction, that kind of fire, it terrifies governments. And it inspires generations. Before Che Guevara became a mural, before the t-shirts, the slogans, the legacy, there was the jungle. Bolivia, 1966. A place of whispers, betrayal, and brutal heat. Che had slipped into the country under a false name, face disguised, beard shaved. He was a ghost now, an international fugitive trying to build another revolution from the ground up. But Bolivia wasn't Cuba. The people were afraid. The terrain was unforgiving. And the support he expected never came. The CIA knew he was there. So did the Bolivian government. So did Washington. He was being hunted. And slowly, the walls closed in. Che's diaries from this period reveal a man transformed. Still idealistic, still unbreakable, but tired, weary. He wrote of hunger, of sickness, of betrayal. His comrades were dropping, not just to bullets, but to despair. Some questioned the mission. Others doubted the locals would rise. But Che kept pushing. He taught. He organized. He fought. Even as the radio static from Havana grew silent. Even as supplies dwindled. Even as hope flickered. And when the end came. When they finally cornered him in the ravine, wounded and surrounded, he didn't beg. He didn't run. He didn't apologize. He stood, bleeding, and said, "I am Che Guevara. I have failed." But even in failure, he became legend. Because he didn't break. And in that jungle, in that final stand, something shifted. The man became a myth. And the myth began its journey around the world. Che was dead, executed in a Bolivian schoolhouse, photographed like a fallen Christ. Eyes half open, chest exposed, laid on a stretcher. The world saw the image and trembled. They meant to kill the man. Instead, they birthed a symbol. Across Latin America, his death became a rallying cry. In Argentina, students whispered his name behind barricades. In Chile, Allende's supporters invoked his vision. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas painted him on their flags. The revolution didn't die in Bolivia. It metastasized, because Che's death proved something terrifying to the powerful. A bullet can stop a heartbeat, but not an idea. Meanwhile, in Havana, Fidel stood before crowds and declared Che a martyr. He called for schools to bear his name. He ordered his writings to be published. He raised him as a patron saint of the Cuban soul. And yet, there were things unsaid. Che had criticized Soviet-style communism. He had grown disillusioned with Cuba's direction. He had written of bureaucrats and stagnation, of revolutions that grow fat and comfortable. And Fidel knew this. But history is written by those who remain. And Che was no longer there to complicate the story. So the myth was shaped. The flaws were softened. The contradictions erased. He became the man who never compromised. The warrior who never faltered. The dreamer who died for all of us. But for those who had truly known him, those who had marched beside him, bled beside him, laughed and argued beside him, the loss was deeper. Because Che was not just an icon. He was a human being. With doubts. With anger. With a fire that could warm or burn. And the world? It chose to remember the flame. For every statue raised in Che's honor, there were stories buried. Stories of those who disagreed. Who were silenced. Who vanished. Because Che Guevara's revolution, like all revolutions, had a cost. He believed in a purified society. One without greed, without injustice, without submission. But in pursuit of that utopia, he believed certain sacrifices were justified. Trials without juries. Executions by firing squad. Labor camps for those deemed unproductive or counter-revolutionary. He called it necessary. He called it justice. He called it revolutionary hygiene. But others called it terror. Che believed that to reshape the world, you had to first tear it apart. Root by root. Bone by bone. And that belief, that dangerous clarity, became both his strength and his tragedy. He saw capitalism as a sickness. He saw moderation as cowardice. He saw dissent as betrayal. And so, as much as he inspired, he also divided. To some, he was a prophet. To others, a fanatic. To some, a liberator. To others, an executioner. And the truth? It lies somewhere in between. Because revolutions, by nature, are not clean. They are born in chaos. They grow in contradiction. And they bleed in every direction. Che Guevara knew that. He embraced it. He once said, "You cannot make a revolution with silk gloves." And he never wore any. But as we celebrate the courage, we must also confront the cost. Not to diminish his legacy, but to understand it fully. To see the man not as a saint, not as a sinner, but as something far more powerful, a mirror. A mirror that asks each of us, How far would you go for your ideals? What would you sacrifice? And at what point does revolution become repression? What kind of world did Che Guevara dream of? It wasn't luxury. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't power. He imagined a new kind of human being, one driven not by profit, but by purpose, not by individual gain, but collective good. He called it El Hombre Nuevo, the new man, a being forged in struggle, refined through sacrifice, and committed wholly to others. He believed that capitalism deformed the soul, that it taught greed, competition, ego. And so, he wanted something radical, a society where doctors volunteered in jungles, where engineers built bridges for strangers, where artists painted for the people, not for galleries. He imagined schools without class divisions, farms without landlords, hospitals where no one paid. He wanted dignity, equality, meaning. But his vision demanded transformation, not just of systems, but of hearts. And that's where the dream met its challenge. Because changing a nation is hard, but changing human nature, that's nearly impossible. Even in Cuba, the new man struggled to emerge. People still bartered. They still competed. They still desired more. And Che grew restless. He wrote essays lamenting the slow pace. He gave speeches warning against apathy. He feared the revolution would calcify, becoming just another bureaucracy in red. So he left, not because he gave up on the dream, but because he believed it needed new soil. Bolivia was meant to be that soil. Another revolution, another beginning. But the jungle buried the dream. And when Che died, so too did the momentum behind El Hombre Nuevo. Today, we live in a world far from Che's vision, a world of billionaires and beggars, of walls and wars, of algorithms and emptiness. But in small corners, in community clinics, in student protests, in songs sung under fire, pieces of his dreams still flicker. Because while the future he tried to build collapsed, the questions he raised remain. Time has a way of softening edges. Today you see Che's face on t-shirts, graffiti walls, coffee mugs, stripped of context, reduced to an aesthetic. But that face, that gaze of defiance, was once a storm that terrified empires. He wasn't a logo. He was a man who bled, believed, and broke. The photo of Fidel and Che together, rifles slung across their backs, smiles cutting through the smoke. It captures more than a moment. It captures an era when two young men believed they could reshape the world, when they traded privilege for danger, when they turned ideas into action. They stood not as saints, but as symbols of something rare, conviction. And whether you agree with them or not, one truth remains. Most people live their whole lives avoiding discomfort, avoiding risk, avoiding the fire. They didn't. And that matters, because history doesn't remember the comfortable. It remembers the courageous. Che Guevara didn't live long enough to see the world he imagined. And Fidel Castro lived long enough to see his creation twist and contradict itself. Cuba became a paradox, educated but impoverished, proud but isolated, revolutionary and static. But their legacy? It lives in the questions we ask. What does justice really look like? Is peace possible without struggle? Can freedom survive without sacrifice? And more personally, what are we willing to stand for when the cost is everything? Because revolutions are not just about flags or governments. They are about the soul, about how we choose to live, who we choose to be, and what we leave behind. Che once wrote, "Let me say, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. Not hate, not vengeance. Love. A love so fierce, it demands action. A love so pure, it endures betrayal. A love so dangerous, it challenges the entire world." Maybe that's the lesson, that even in a world of shadows, there are still people who burn so brightly, we see them long after they're gone. Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, two men, one photograph, 1,000 contradictions. But when the smoke clears, When the slogans fade, what remains is not the politics, it's the courage. And maybe that's enough. Maybe, one day, someone will look at a photo of you, frozen in time, standing for something, and feel the same chill. Because in the end, we're all just moments in someone else's history. What matters is what we do before we become a memory.